In the early hours of January 16th, while heavy snow continued to blanket the winding roads, a utility worker made his way down Jacobs Creek Road. Through the curtain of white, something caught his attention: a silver SUV, oddly positioned near the edge of an embankment. The engine was still running. Curious and uneasy, he pulled over, stepping out into the cold. Crunching through the snow, he approached the vehicle cautiously. Inside, in the driver's seat, sat a woman, motionless. Within minutes, emergency services arrived. The scene was eerily still. The cold air pressed in, and the only sound was the low hum of the idling engine. One single set of footprints trailed away from the SUV, vanishing into the dark woods. There were no skid marks or tire tracks that might suggest a crash. The vehicle bore no damage, and there was no evidence of forced entry. It didn't take long to identify the woman. She was Michelle Nice, a mother of 3, a consultant for Macy's, and the wife of a once prominent scientist. Her death was sudden, mysterious, and profoundly tragic. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Michelle Nice was born in November 1969, the 6th of 7 children, in a modest fishing village nestled on the fringe of Manila Bay in the Philippines. Her earliest memories were painted with the scent of salt water, the sound of boats clinking against wooden docks, and the voices of vendors calling out in the early morning. The family home, like many in the village, was a simple wooden structure built on stilts above the tidal edge. There was no electricity, no plumbing, no modern amenities, only the bare essentials, shared smiles, and unwavering resilience. Despite the economic challenges surrounding her, Michelle's childhood was filled with warmth. Her parents worked tirelessly to provide for their large family, and though there was rarely enough money, there was never a shortage of love. Her father, in particular, was her anchor. A quiet man with strong hands and kind eyes, he taught her the importance of humility, perseverance, and hope. Their bond ran deep. He encouraged her to dream, even when those dreams felt impossibly distant. Michelle was not the loudest among her siblings. Reserved and introspective, she often watched more than she spoke. But her presence lingered, felt more than heard. There was something striking about her, something unspoken in the way she carried herself. It was a kind of grace, a quiet strength that drew others to her. From a young age, she held aspirations that reached far beyond the bamboo walls of her home. She yearned for more than what the village could offer, more than the life she saw playing out around her. She craved opportunity, adventure, and above all, love. For as long as she could remember, Michelle Rivera had been fascinated by the idea of the United States. She had heard stories, seen photos, and listened intently to tales shared by those who had family abroad. America, to her, represented possibility. At just 16, Michelle achieved something extraordinary. She was accepted into a prestigious school for administration and business. For someone from her background, this was a rare and remarkable achievement. It was the kind of opportunity that could alter the course of her entire life. But dreams are often weighed down by reality. After only 1 semester, the financial burden became too heavy to carry. Her family simply couldn't afford the tuition or the costs associated with living away from home. Though devastated, Michelle refused to let go of her ambitions. Her parents, with tears in their eyes, promised they would do everything in their power to save enough for her return. Still, Michelle had no intention of standing still while waiting. Determined to take control of her future, she packed what little she owned and moved in with an aunt in a nearby town. There, she began working as a waitress in a modest restaurant. It was a busy place, popular with both locals and visitors. Coincidentally, the town sat near a U.S. military base, and Michelle found herself serving American patrons on a daily basis. English became a regular part of her environment, but speaking it fluently was still a hurdle. She couldn't afford language lessons or tutors, yet she knew that mastering English was essential if she ever hoped to build a life in the United States. In a moment of bold creativity, Michelle came up with a unique solution. She placed a small advertisement in the Manila Times, seeking a pen pal from America who could help her practice English. The ad was brief and modest, accompanied by a simple photograph. She had no idea that the ad she wrote in the quiet corner of a noisy restaurant would change her life forever. Thousands of miles away in Pennsylvania, a man named Jonathan Nice came across that ad. Jonathan, born on May 26, 1950, was the eldest of 4 brothers raised in the modest town of Collegeville. His upbringing was defined by discipline, humility, and hard work. His parents were not wealthy, and raising 4 boys demanded sacrifice and frugality. Still, the family found strength in unity and perseverance. Jonathan's academic path led him to Temple University in Philadelphia, where he worked tirelessly to support himself. His passion for science and medicine carried him through graduate and postdoctoral work. He eventually found himself at the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, and later at the Kenneth Norris Cancer Center, 2 prestigious institutions where he gained a reputation as a driven, dedicated researcher. Jonathan was known not only for his intellect, but for his quiet intensity. He was methodical, thoughtful, and deeply committed to his work. During those formative years, Jonathan met a woman named Sylvie. Their relationship spanned 7 years and ended in what friends described as a peaceful, respectful divorce. Though the marriage ended without bitterness, it left Jonathan with a lingering void. As he entered middle age, a new desire emerged: to build a family, to share his life with someone deeply and sincerely. In the early 1990s, that yearning led to an unexpected encounter. While having lunch in a cafeteria, Jonathan met a young woman from the Philippines. Her warmth and elegance caught his attention immediately, though he soon learned she was already in a relationship. Still, she handed him a newspaper, the Manila Times, and pointed out a pen pal ad placed by a friend of hers. That friend was Michelle. The ad intrigued him. There was something about her photo, her expression, her eyes, that lingered in his mind. She looked thoughtful, hopeful, and real. On a whim, he wrote her a letter. In that first correspondence, Jonathan included an older photo of himself. Wanting to bridge the age gap, or perhaps nervous about it, he shaved nearly 10 years off his actual age, telling Michelle he was in his early 30s when, in reality, he was closer to 40. Jonathan had sent Michelle a photograph of himself early in their correspondence, but the image, taken years earlier, painted a version of him that no longer reflected reality. In the photo, he looked young, vibrant, and full of promise. A man seemingly on the verge of settling down and building a life rooted in stability and success. He had carefully chosen that picture, knowing first impressions mattered. Alongside it, he crafted letters filled with warmth and sincerity, sharing hopes, dreams, and assurances that he was ready to create a life with someone who could share in his vision. Michelle, who was then in her late teens or early 20s, responded with equal earnestness. For her, each letter that arrived was a small miracle, pages that carried words from a world she had only imagined. The letters took weeks, sometimes months, to travel across oceans, but the distance seemed to shrink with every envelope that arrived. Jonathan spoke of things Michelle had only dared to dream about: a home in America, children running through sunlit rooms, a marriage built not just on love, but on mutual respect and shared purpose. His letters were vivid, filled with imagery of peaceful suburban neighborhoods, supportive communities, and a future far removed from the hardships of her upbringing. He painted a picture of a life where family came first and where her dreams, too, could flourish. For Michelle, whose sense of duty toward her family was deeply ingrained, the idea of marrying a stable and successful man from the United States must have seemed like both a personal blessing and an opportunity to give back to those she loved. It wasn't just about escaping poverty. It was about stepping into a world where she could contribute, support, and maybe even thrive. Perhaps, in some quiet corner of her heart, it felt like destiny. Yet, through all the promises and affection, one thing remained unspoken. Neither Jonathan nor Michelle told their families about the growing relationship. Their romance existed in a private space, nurtured by ink and paper, held together by hope, and untouched by the judgment of others. It was a secret world they had created together, one that offered escape, connection, and possibility. After many months of exchanging letters, Jonathan made a decision that would alter both of their lives forever. He resolved to travel to the Philippines and marry the woman he had fallen for, despite never having met her in person. His certainty was unwavering. He believed that what they had was real, that their connection, built on honesty and emotional vulnerability, could survive the leap from paper to reality. When they met for the first time in June of 1990, Michelle was filled with anticipation. But as Jonathan stepped off the plane, she was struck by an unexpected wave of surprise. The man standing before her was clearly older than the image he had sent. Time had altered the lines on his face, added a heaviness to his frame, and revealed a gap between the image he had shared and the person who now stood before her. The difference was clear, even jarring, and yet, after a moment of pause, Michelle said yes. Despite the initial shock, there was something about Jonathan that still drew her in. He was articulate, respectful, and clearly cared for her deeply. Her father, a man who had always placed family above all else, gave his blessing after meeting Jonathan. Promises were made. Jonathan vowed to support Michelle's family financially, and Michelle, perhaps still processing her own reservations, chose to believe in the dream they had built together from afar. The wedding took place just days later, on June 11th, 1990. Even then, Jonathan continued to obscure the truth. On the official marriage certificate, he listed his birth year as 1958, making himself appear 8 years younger than he actually was. The deception was subtle but intentional. No one from Jonathan's family attended the ceremony. In fact, none of them even knew he had flown across the world to marry a woman he had never met before. He kept the entire event a secret, worried that people back home might misunderstand or judge his decision. The idea of others suggesting he had engaged in some kind of transactional relationship haunted him. Together, Jonathan and Michelle rehearsed a cover story. When she arrived in the United States, they would tell everyone they had met in Hawaii, where he had allegedly been attending a medical conference. It was a story they both committed to, knowing it would make things easier when questions inevitably came. The visa process was long and complex. Nearly a year passed before Michelle could join Jonathan in the U.S. During that time, their letters remained steady, each one reinforcing the bond they had forged. Finally, on April 19, 1991, Michelle boarded a plane for the very first time in her life and made the long journey across the Pacific. They settled into a modest home in North Carolina, where Jonathan worked as a research professor at East Carolina University. In the beginning, life together felt like an adventure. They traveled to California, exploring sun-soaked coastlines and bustling cities, treating the trip like an extended honeymoon. Jonathan introduced Michelle to friends and colleagues as his wife, and most accepted the Hawaii story without much scrutiny. Those who were skeptical chose not to press. Jonathan seemed happier than anyone had ever seen him. In January 1992, Michelle gave birth to their first child, a son they named Alex. Less than 2 years later, in November 1993, their second son Trevor was born. Jonathan was overjoyed. He embraced fatherhood with devotion and pride. His office at the university was decorated with family photos, snapshots of vacations, birthdays, and quiet moments at home. He often said that Michelle and the children had given him something he never thought he'd have: a home filled with laughter and life, a reason to live beyond his research. But beneath the calm surface of their seemingly idyllic life, undercurrents of tension began to swirl. Jonathan's insecurities grew stronger with time. Michelle, with her warmth, charisma, and beauty, drew attention wherever she went. She made friends easily, connected with neighbors, and adapted quickly to her new life. And as her confidence grew, so did Jonathan's quiet anxiety. He became increasingly possessive. Small doubts turned into long silences, then into subtle restrictions. Though he never voiced it directly, Jonathan worried that Michelle might one day realize she had choices, and that she might choose a different path, one that didn't include him. Professionally, however, Jonathan's star was rising. In 1995, he took a bold leap by founding his own biotech company, Epigenesis Pharmaceuticals. The company focused on pioneering treatments for respiratory illnesses, particularly asthma, a condition that affected millions but still lacked curative solutions. Jonathan's research was ambitious. He wasn't just trying to manage symptoms. He wanted to change the way medicine approached disease at the genetic level. Years of study culminated in a breakthrough. His research was published in Nature, one of the most respected scientific journals in the world. In the article, he introduced EPI 2010, a revolutionary gene therapy delivered through an inhaler. The treatment targeted asthma at its molecular source, suppressing the expression of the genes responsible for the condition. It was the kind of innovation that could reshape the medical field. Investors took notice quickly. Funding poured in. Jonathan was invited to speak at international conferences and appeared in media interviews. He presented himself as not only a dedicated scientist, but a man who cared deeply about improving lives. In March 1998, their third child was born, a daughter named Samantha. With 3 children, a growing company, and public recognition, Jonathan appeared to be at the pinnacle of personal and professional fulfillment. One of the biggest turning points in Jonathan's career came when a prominent investor placed $5 million into his biotechnology firm. The momentum was immediate. With growing credibility in the scientific community and renewed interest from venture capital, Epigenesis Pharmaceuticals began to scale rapidly. Annual operating budgets soon surged to $11 million, and the once modest startup transformed into a rising player in the pharmaceutical landscape. With growth came responsibility and more travel. Jonathan's schedule became increasingly demanding. He spent at least 1 week of every month away from home, flying to conferences, holding private meetings with investors, and pitching the company's vision to potential partners. At times, it seemed like he was living out of a suitcase, always on the move, always chasing the next breakthrough or checkbook. His presence at home became increasingly sporadic. By the year 2000, the company's success demanded even more. A larger, more strategically located headquarters was necessary to accommodate expanding operations and better connect with East Coast investors and talent. Jonathan made the decision to relocate the company's base to New Jersey. And naturally, the family followed. They settled in Hopewell Township, a serene and affluent suburb known for its expansive properties and quiet charm. Their new home was nothing short of grand, a sprawling estate with manicured lawns, soaring ceilings, and every modern amenity. On paper, it was the American dream fully realized, a luxury home in a respected neighborhood, 3 healthy children, and a career that had, at one point, seemed unstoppable. But behind the gleaming windows and freshly painted walls, life for Michelle was becoming increasingly difficult. She had left behind more than just an address in North Carolina. She had left behind her circle of friends, a community that had welcomed her, and the familiar rhythm of a place where she felt rooted. In New Jersey, she knew no one. Jonathan's absences were now more frequent, his mind consumed with corporate pressures, boardroom politics, and the science that once brought him so much joy. Michelle, left to navigate a new town with 3 young children and no emotional support system, found herself lonely and disconnected. Seeking structure and self-care, she began going to a local gym. At first, it was just a way to stay active and break the monotony of her days. But over time, it became a place where she could briefly reconnect with other adults, a place to feel seen. Jonathan, increasingly uneasy about her independence, responded with a controlling gesture masked as generosity. He had a private gym built inside their home. On the surface, it was a gift. In reality, it was a strategy, an effort to limit her time in public, to pull her back into the world he could control. Michelle later described the shift as being placed in a golden cage, a beautiful prison that sparkled on the outside but left her feeling increasingly confined. By 2001, Michelle was searching for purpose beyond family duties. That search led her to a new personal project, a complete redesign of the family garden. It was more than landscaping. It was her attempt to shape something of her own, to express herself in a space untouched by Jonathan's rules. Jonathan, hoping to please her, approved the plan despite its steep $50,000 price tag. She hired a landscaping crew, and among them was a man who stood out, Miguel de Jesus. He was professional, quiet, and warm, with a presence that contrasted the cold distance growing between Michelle and her husband. At first, the connection was harmless. Friendly conversations, shared laughter, a spark, perhaps, but nothing more. Then came the unraveling. By 2002, Jonathan's professional life was taking a turn for the worse. The asthma treatment he had once championed as a revolutionary advance in gene therapy, EPI 2010, was not delivering the promised results in clinical trials. Although the compound had shown strong results in lab settings and animal models, it fell short in human trials, particularly among patients who were already using standard asthma medications. The excitement around the drug began to fade. Investors, once eager and confident, grew restless. Then came the dot-com crash, and with it, a widespread collapse in confidence across technology and biotech sectors. Money dried up. The board of directors began asking hard questions. Ultimately, they made a bold decision. Jonathan was to be replaced. He was formally ousted from the very company he had founded. In March 2003, his dismissal was finalized. The dream he had nurtured for years was stripped from his hands. With no steady income and the weight of a substantial mortgage pressing down on them, the family's finances became increasingly unstable. But Jonathan, unwilling to reveal weakness, pretended that nothing had changed. To neighbors and acquaintances, he spoke confidently about new projects and exciting ventures. He claimed to be working from home on special research initiatives and even told some he was writing a children's book. Behind closed doors, however, Jonathan's demeanor shifted. He began drinking more heavily. His mood, once ambitious and optimistic, became brooding and distant. On his darker days, he could turn cold, emotionally detached, sometimes sharply irritable. The confident scientist had become a man adrift, clinging to appearances. While Jonathan spiraled quietly, Michelle was navigating her own path. Her connection with Miguel deepened, moving beyond casual chats to something more intimate. They were both married. Both had children. But somehow, in the spaces between their conversations, something else had taken root. Something emotional, and eventually, something physical. At first, Jonathan noticed nothing. His world was consumed by professional loss, reputational damage, and the mental strain of maintaining a carefully constructed facade. But gradually, small things drew his attention. Late-night phone calls, unusual charges on the phone bill, a quiet shift in Michelle's behavior. Then came a moment that would shake the fragile structure of their marriage even further. At a birthday party for one of Jonathan's brothers, a casual family gathering meant to be lighthearted, a seemingly innocent comment changed everything. Jonathan's mother let slip that he was, in fact, the eldest sibling. Michelle froze. For years, Jonathan had told her that the brother being celebrated was the oldest. It was a strange lie, subtle but deliberate. And in that moment, years of confusion suddenly aligned. Michelle was stunned. The man she had married had lied about his age from the very beginning, altering the truth to appear younger. 8 years of deception. 8 years of half-truths and omissions that she had unknowingly accepted. The realization shattered what little trust remained. Though Jonathan tried to explain and apologize, something had shifted irreversibly in Michelle's heart. It wasn't just about the lie. It was about everything that had been built on that lie. She felt betrayed, disillusioned, and emotionally isolated. It was during this emotional void that she turned once more to Miguel. This time, she gave him her number. She wanted to meet, for coffee, for conversation, for connection. What had once been cautious turned bold. Their meetings became more frequent, and their relationship evolved into a full-fledged affair. They met in private, booked hotel rooms under aliases, exchanged gifts, and shared intimate moments away from the scrutiny of their everyday lives. Michelle, craving affection and attention, even bought Miguel expensive items, gifts she kept hidden from Jonathan. But secrets rarely remain buried. In late 2003, Miguel's wife, Patricia, discovered the affair. And when she confirmed the truth, her response was swift and direct. Patricia confronted Michelle face to face, demanding answers. Jonathan's growing suspicions began to harden into certainty. For months, something had been gnawing at him. Unspoken tension, lingering glances, quiet absences that couldn't be explained away. He had already sensed that Michelle was drifting from him, emotionally and physically. Their arguments at home had become sharper, more frequent, and less easily resolved. The warmth that once marked their conversations had turned into cold silences or bitter remarks. Jonathan, ever analytical, started digging. He combed through their phone bills, cross-referencing call logs and timestamps. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. Michelle had been speaking to Miguel frequently. Too frequently. The frequency, timing, and pattern of the calls left little room for misinterpretation. He didn't want to believe it, but the facts were undeniable. Yet, despite knowing the truth, Jonathan couldn't bring himself to confront Michelle directly. He feared what would come next. He feared hearing her say the words he dreaded most, that she no longer loved him, that she was leaving. Even after the lies, the betrayal, and the distance between them, Jonathan wasn't ready to let her go. He still wanted to believe their marriage could survive. So, instead of confrontation, he manufactured control. In July of 2003, Jonathan told Michelle he had received a disturbing phone call. According to his version of events, someone had secretly recorded her at a motel, footage of her and Miguel, and was now threatening to release it unless he paid $500,000. It was, he claimed, a blackmail attempt. Panicked and shaken, Michelle admitted the affair. With trembling honesty, she promised it was over, that it had ended, and it would not continue. She swore she would make things right, for the sake of their children, for the sake of everything they had built. Jonathan, seizing the moment, called Miguel directly. His tone was controlled, but firm. He warned Miguel to stay away from Michelle or face the consequences of full exposure, not just to his own family, but publicly. The conversation had its intended effect. Miguel ended the relationship that day. To cement the illusion, Jonathan filed a police report about the supposed blackmail. But law enforcement, trained to spot inconsistencies, quickly noticed problems. There had been no actual ransom drop, no concrete demands, no traceable phone number. The story didn't quite add up. Still, Jonathan maintained the lie. For Michelle, for the authorities, for himself. Privately, he hoped things might return to the way they were, that this storm, too, might pass, that Michelle, having seen the danger and damage the affair could cause, would recommit to their family. But what Jonathan wanted was no longer within reach. For Michelle, something fundamental had shifted. Even after the affair ended, the unhappiness remained. She began quietly telling those closest to her, siblings, cousins, trusted friends, that she was thinking seriously about divorce. The golden cage she had once tolerated now felt suffocating. She no longer saw her future as tied to Jonathan's. Still financially dependent on her husband, Michelle made a move toward autonomy. She took a job as a beauty consultant at a Macy's department store nearby. It wasn't just about money, it was about having something of her own, a life outside the walls of their home, a sense of purpose beyond being a wife and mother. The young woman who had once dreamed of America was now dreaming of freedom. And although she had promised Jonathan that the affair was over, it quietly resumed only weeks later. Michelle began seeing Miguel again, in secret, slipping away for brief meetings. What she didn't know was that Miguel was not entirely the man he appeared to be. Miguel, charming and enigmatic, had a complicated past. Known by multiple aliases, he was wanted in another state for failure to pay child support. His history included more than one chapter he had never shared with Michelle. Eventually, someone tipped off the authorities. Miguel was arrested. And while the charges were administrative, they painted a fuller picture, one that raised questions about his integrity and reliability. When Jonathan learned that Michelle had resumed the affair, even after the blackmail story and her tearful promises, something inside him fractured. He unraveled. His mental state, already unstable, deteriorated rapidly. He began seeing a doctor and was prescribed medication, but instead of stabilizing his mood, the drugs only seemed to cloud his judgment further. His mind raced between obsession and despair, between hope and heartbreak. Jealousy consumed him. He became preoccupied with the idea that Michelle was going to leave him permanently. On some days, he convinced himself she would stay. On others, he couldn't silence the voice whispering that it was already over. The fear was relentless. Then, the weather changed. and with it, the trajectory of their lives. On the evening of January 15th, 2004, a brutal snowstorm swept through Hopewell Township. The roads were slick and visibility low, but Michelle, determined and focused, went to work anyway. She was saving every penny she could. If she was going to file for divorce, she needed financial independence, and she was preparing for it, one shift at a time. She finished work at Macy's around 9:15 p.m., but instead of going home, she drove to meet Miguel. They rendezvoused at a familiar motel, one they had used before. Their time together lasted roughly 2 hours. Around 11 p.m., they said goodbye. Michelle never made it home. In the early hours of January 16th, as snow continued to blanket the roads, a utility worker driving along Jacobs Creek Road spotted something unusual. A silver SUV was parked oddly near an embankment, its engine still running. He pulled over and cautiously approached. There was a woman inside in the driver's seat. Emergency services arrived within minutes. The scene was strange, quiet, cold, unsettling. A single set of footprints led away from the vehicle and disappeared into the woods. There were no tire tracks indicating an accident, no damage to the vehicle, no sign of forced entry. The woman was soon identified as Michelle Nice, a mother of 3, a Macy's consultant, and the wife of a once prominent scientist. Her sudden death was tragic, but what disturbed investigators most was the evidence, or lack thereof. There were no footprints leading toward the vehicle, only away from it. And more alarmingly, the autopsy results told a different story. Michelle had not died in a car crash. Her injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma. The case instantly shifted from tragedy to suspicion. Investigators turned their attention to the 3 people with the clearest motives: her husband, Jonathan, her lover, Miguel, and Miguel's wife, Patricia. It was a delicate web of relationships, one built on secrets, jealousy, and betrayal. They started with Jonathan. Initially, he presented himself as stunned and devastated. But when detectives asked basic questions, his story began to wobble. He gave conflicting accounts, at first claiming he'd spoken to Michelle that afternoon, then later saying it was in the evening. At one point, he suggested she might have run away, that she had simply decided to leave him and start over. But detectives had already begun connecting the dots. They discovered Jonathan's financial collapse. They uncovered the inconsistencies in his background, including the lie about his age. They learned about the emotional deterioration, the control issues, and most crucially, his awareness of Michelle's ongoing affair. It painted a clear portrait, a man whose life was unraveling, personally, professionally, and emotionally. Eventually, under pressure and mounting evidence, Jonathan confessed. He was arrested and formally charged. The courtroom was quiet as the trial commenced in 2005. The case had captured local headlines and sent waves through the once quiet communities of both Hopewell Township and Collegeville, Pennsylvania. As the trial unfolded, Jonathan changed his story. He no longer portrayed himself as simply confused or distraught. Instead, he offered a new version of events, one that painted him as a man pushed beyond his emotional limits. He claimed that Michelle had attacked him first, suggesting a sudden confrontation that spiraled out of control. According to Jonathan, her alleged aggression provoked a reaction in the heat of the moment, and the situation tragically escalated. This version of events was a drastic departure from earlier statements, but the defense framed it as a case of intense emotional distress. The legal team positioned Jonathan not as a cold-blooded perpetrator, but as a man overwhelmed by heartbreak and desperation. The jury was not unmoved. After lengthy deliberation and under the recommendation of a plea agreement, Jonathan Nice was not convicted of murder, but rather of manslaughter under the influence of extreme emotional disturbance. The decision carried weight. The judge made it unequivocally clear in court that while the act may have been fueled by emotion, it was still a crime, not an accident, and it demanded accountability. Jonathan was sentenced to 8 years in state prison. A remote and rugged stretch of wilderness located nearly 85 miles north of Salt Lake City. It was a vast, heavily forested region, scenic in daylight, daunting at night. Detectives understood the significance immediately. No one drives nearly 2 hours into the mountains without a reason. Despite the overwhelming scale of the terrain, their search did not drag on for long. Down by the river, tucked beneath a thick tangle of overgrowth, they found something. Items burned and left behind. These items were not just clues. They were unmistakable confirmations that Mackenzie had been there. The fire had failed to erase her presence. DNA evidence, coupled with eyewitness reports and digital data, began weaving a chilling and undeniable picture. In the heart of a wooded area, Mackenzie Lueck was finally found. Unfortunately, it was already too late. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. Mackenzie Lueck was just 23 years old. Originally from the beachside city of El Segundo, California, she was the second of 4 children in the Lueck family and their only daughter. Growing up sandwiched between 3 brothers might have intimidated some, but not Mackenzie. It shaped her into someone vibrant, competitive, and full of energy. She carved out her identity in a household filled with laughter, rivalry, and love. She was her parents' shining light, spirited, compassionate, and endlessly determined. Mackenzie's love for athletics was more than just a hobby. It was a cornerstone of her personality. She embraced physical activity with the kind of devotion that spoke of both joy and discipline. Whether she was cycling for miles down the California coast, dominating the lanes in competitive swimming, charging across the water polo pool, or sitting in the stands as a spirited supporter of her school's football team, Mackenzie lived and breathed sports. Her commitment went beyond play. She understood the strength and focus it took to balance team loyalty, physical stamina, and the responsibility of performance. When it came time for college, Mackenzie, while deeply attached to her California roots, longed to stretch her wings and experience life beyond the familiar. Seeking both distance and growth, she ultimately chose the University of Utah, a full 700 miles away from the world she knew. There, she embarked on a double academic track, majoring in kinesiology and pre-nursing while minoring in health studies. Her ambition wasn't just academic. It was driven by a desire to help others. Mackenzie dreamed of a career in healthcare, aiming to heal and uplift those in need. Her time in Utah was intense and deeply immersive. She joined Alpha Chi Omega, a sorority that would become a huge part of her social and philanthropic life. This wasn't just a sisterhood for Mackenzie, it became a second family. But being part of the sorority came with high expectations. Members had to maintain a minimum 2.5 GPA and contribute to community service projects. On top of her rigorous studies and sorority responsibilities, Mackenzie also held down 2 jobs. Her life became a whirlwind of lectures, work shifts, volunteer hours, and social commitments. Her days were packed to the brim, leaving little time for rest. But that's how Mackenzie preferred it. She thrived in the hustle, rarely complained, and always had a smile on her face. By her 3rd year, however, even Mackenzie recognized the need to slow down just a bit. She made the decision to drop to part-time status, entering her senior year with fewer classes. She found comfort and independence in her cozy off-campus townhouse, which she shared not with roommates, but with a small collection of beloved pets, hedgehogs, guinea pigs, and cats. Her deep affection for animals was something her friends always admired. One of her closest friends, Nova, recalled with amusement how Mackenzie once threw an elaborate birthday party for one of her cats, also named Nova, complete with champagne for her human guests, a cat food cake, and colorful party hats. Everyone played along because Mackenzie made the absurd seem delightful. Her sorority sister Kennedy described Mackenzie as someone with an instinct to care for others. She was, in Kennedy's words, a nurturer through and through. Even in the most stressful times, Mackenzie was the first to cook a warm meal, offer a ride, or bring over a drink with a reassuring word. She always wanted to make sure everyone around her was okay, Kennedy remembered. She just got joy from giving, whether that meant food, comfort, or laughter. And she was always smiling. So much so that when she had braces, her smile would sometimes cut into her lips, but she never let it stop her. That's how much she smiled. But as summer approached in 2019, a personal tragedy cast a heavy shadow over her usually sunny demeanor. Mackenzie's grandmother, someone she was exceptionally close to, passed away. The loss hit her hard. Though she didn't talk about it constantly, those around her could sense the emotional weight she was carrying. In mid-June, she returned to Los Angeles to attend the funeral, surrounded by family, grief, and the complex emotions that come with saying goodbye to someone irreplaceable. After the service, Mackenzie boarded a flight back to Salt Lake City on the night of June 16th. At exactly 1 a.m. on June 17th, she touched down at Salt Lake City International Airport. Still emotionally raw and physically drained, she reached for her phone and sent a message to her mother, Diana. Landed. Love you, Mama. It was short, affectionate, and typical of Mackenzie. But what should have been the start of a return to her routine would instead mark the beginning of a mystery that would leave friends, family, and investigators deeply unsettled. Around 2 a.m., she appeared to be trying to find transportation, possibly using Uber or another ride-hailing app. Her mother texted back, but this time, the usual blue iMessage bubble turned green. It was a subtle but potentially significant change. A green message could mean many things. Perhaps Mackenzie's battery had died, or her phone had switched to SMS due to poor signal. Still, her mom waited for a reply that never came. At first, no one panicked. Mackenzie had a habit of staying busy, and with everything she had going on, the funeral, school, work, it didn't seem unusual that she might need time to decompress. Friends assumed she was overwhelmed, possibly sleeping or just taking a break from communication. But as the hours turned into an entire day, and then into 2, people began to grow uneasy. Her friend Kennedy noticed early signs that something wasn't right. Mackenzie wasn't opening her Snapchats, an app she used frequently. There were no Instagram posts, no new messages, and no signs that she was active online at all. It was unlike her to stay completely silent. Even in her busiest moments, she usually sent a quick message or reaction. Kennedy felt a pit forming in her stomach. Something was off, deeply off. On June 20th, 3 days after Mackenzie's last message, her father, Greg, could no longer bear the silence. With growing dread, he requested a welfare check. He told the authorities he hadn't heard from his daughter and that her phone kept going straight to voicemail. She hadn't contacted anyone, hadn't returned to work, and had missed several key events, including an important exam and a close friend's wedding back home in California. Officers were dispatched to Mackenzie's townhouse. Her car was in the driveway, just as it should be, but no one answered the door. They peered through the windows but saw no signs of activity. The house was eerily still. Police began contacting her circle of friends, employers, and university officials. Slowly, a troubling pattern began to form. Mackenzie hadn't shown up for work. She'd missed university obligations. No one had seen her. Not in person, not online, not anywhere. Nearly a full week had passed since her flight landed. The usual theories, burnout, emotional retreat, phone troubles, no longer made sense. This wasn't just someone taking a break. It was beginning to look like something far more serious had happened. The search intensified. Investigators reviewed airport surveillance footage. Mackenzie could clearly be seen exiting the plane. She looked tired but calm. She walked alone, collected her luggage, and exited the terminal. There was no one waiting for her. No one seemed to follow her. She didn't stop to talk to anyone. The footage raised more questions than it answered. How could someone disappear from a busy international airport in the age of constant connectivity and digital footprints? Where had Mackenzie gone after she left the airport? Who had she intended to meet, if anyone? And why had all contact ceased so abruptly? Roughly 40 minutes after Mackenzie Lick's flight touched down at Salt Lake City International Airport in the early hours of June 17, 2019, she ordered a Lyft ride. It was a choice that, in hindsight, would become the last known movement in a series of decisions that left her family, friends, and law enforcement puzzled and desperate for answers. The ride took her to Hatch Park, a quiet public space located approximately 9 miles from her off-campus townhouse. It was not a place Mackenzie had ever been known to frequent. Friends and family were immediately struck by how out of character the destination was. According to those close to her, Mackenzie had no connections to that part of town and certainly no known reason to visit the park, especially in the middle of the night. Even those who knew her best were at a loss to explain it. Her parents, still processing the grief of her grandmother's funeral, which Mackenzie had just flown home to attend, were the last to hear from her. She had texted them with a quick, reassuring update that she had landed safely. There were no signs of distress or unusual concern in the message. But shortly after that, she disappeared from contact entirely. Lyft, the rideshare company that transported her that night, later confirmed they were actively cooperating with law enforcement. They stated there were no known issues or unusual incidents during Mackenzie's ride. According to the company's internal trip data and the driver's statement, Mackenzie had been dropped off safely, and the driver continued on to his next pickups without delay. Everything about the ride on the surface seemed ordinary. But that, of course, was the problem. Nothing else that followed was ordinary. The Lick family, originally from Southern California, found themselves having to push hard for answers. They sought legal assistance to obtain subpoenas for Mackenzie's phone records, hoping the data would shed light on her last known activities and communications. Meanwhile, the Lyft driver was located and interviewed. He recounted that Mackenzie appeared calm, alert, and fully in control during the ride. She even acknowledged that Hatch Park seemed like an odd place to be dropped off at that hour, but she told him she was meeting someone. She didn't specify who. What stood out to the driver, and later to investigators, was that Mackenzie made no effort to conceal the peculiarity of her destination. She was still texting someone during the drive, and while the driver thought the destination strange, her demeanor was composed. She showed no visible signs of being upset, afraid, or distressed. She had luggage, which he helped unload upon arrival. As he was doing so, he noticed a car already parked in the lot. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a vague, shadowy figure step out of that vehicle. Due to the darkness and distance, he couldn't provide a clear description. It was merely a blurred silhouette. But what he could say was this. As he returned to his car, he heard voices. Mackenzie and the unknown person speaking. Nothing about the conversation seemed hostile. There were no raised voices, no signs of an argument or fear. If anything, it sounded like a meeting that had been expected, perhaps even planned in advance. The driver pulled away, unaware that he had just been the last verified person to see Mackenzie Lick. Investigators verified the driver's story using GPS data, dash cam information, and phone records. His route checked out completely, and police were confident that he was not involved in Mackenzie's disappearance. Still, troubling questions remained. Who was the figure in the car? And what did Mackenzie intend when she asked to be taken to such a secluded location in the middle of the night? As the days passed with no word from Mackenzie, her friends and family's concern grew into deep anxiety. Authorities, however, initially stated that they had no evidence of foul play. This cautious stance frustrated those closest to her. Mackenzie wasn't the kind of person to vanish without warning. Her life was full of responsibilities: school, work, pets, relationships. She would never walk away from it all without saying a word. Soon, large groups of volunteers, including her sorority sisters, classmates, and community members, began organizing daily flyer distributions. They worked tirelessly, handing out missing person posters to every car that passed, speaking to media outlets, and maintaining a visible presence on the streets of Salt Lake City. Posters with Mackenzie's face and the haunting question, "Have you seen Mackenzie?" started appearing on poles, walls, and windows throughout the area. Then came a twist no one expected. A man named Rob, who came forward as a casual acquaintance, told police he and a friend had randomly met Mackenzie at a local bar not long before her disappearance. The encounter occurred days prior to June 17th. According to Rob, Mackenzie had been friendly, upbeat, and conversational. They shared drinks and spoke for close to an hour. During their conversation, Mackenzie revealed something that was news to everyone else in her life. She had recently joined a dating platform. Rob said she didn't offer too many specifics about what she was looking for, but she made it clear that she had moved on from 2 serious past relationships and was open to meeting new people. For her friends and family, this revelation came as a complete surprise. None of them knew she was using online dating, and the idea that she may have met someone from that platform the night she disappeared cast an entirely new light on the investigation. Rob later discovered Mackenzie's profile on the same dating app. The last recorded activity on her account? June 16, the night before she went missing. This new information opened an unexpected and potentially crucial door in the case. Police began reviewing her online presence more closely. They found that there had been no activity on her phone after her last known text. Her social media remained dormant. Her bank accounts had not been used. She hadn't touched any of her usual services or subscriptions, but a financial review uncovered something startling. The plane tickets for her trip to Los Angeles had been purchased by a man she met through the dating site. Not only that, but investigators discovered a separate bank account in Mackenzie's name, one her family hadn't known existed. Into that account, a $300 deposit had been made by another individual who was, at the time, completely unknown to them. Greg Lick, her father, told investigators he was shocked to discover the second bank account. It was not the kind of secrecy he associated with his daughter. Using this lead, authorities began piecing together her digital trail, tracing contacts from her dating profile, examining her phone records, and digging into her recent social media behavior. Among the many pieces of digital evidence collected in the early days of the investigation, one particular discovery stood out. It would prove to be a turning point. Investigators determined that Mackenzie Lick had recently followed a relatively obscure Instagram page, one that was not widely known or connected to her established circle of friends and acquaintances. This page, innocuous at first glance, ultimately served as a digital breadcrumb that led authorities to a curious detail. Mackenzie had been exchanging messages with a phone number that wasn't saved in her contacts. The number had only appeared in her communication records days before her sudden disappearance. Detectives quickly traced the number to a residence in Salt Lake City, Utah. That home belonged to a man named Ayoola Ajayi, someone who had not previously surfaced in the investigation. Known to acquaintances by the nickname AJ, Ajayi's name began to show up with increasing frequency in connection to the case. Ajayi was a 31-year-old man who lived only a short distance from Hatch Park, the last known location where Mackenzie had been seen. On paper, he was an unlikely suspect. His public persona was that of a well-spoken, educated individual with a career in technology. Officially, he worked as a support analyst for Dell, a role that conveyed stability and professionalism. But there was more to AJ than his resume suggested. He also marketed himself as a part-time model, showcasing photos on social media that presented him as confident, stylish, and upwardly mobile. At a glance, nothing about Ayoola Ajayi's life seemed overtly suspicious. If anything, the life he curated online projected an image of calculated normalcy. He was recently divorced, seemingly introverted, and lived in a modest house in the Fair Park neighborhood of Salt Lake City, a diverse, residential area known for its quiet streets and sense of community. He had no known criminal record. To neighbors and co-workers, he was polite, reserved, and appeared to be focused on his career and personal goals. Yet sometimes, the most unsettling truths hide behind the mask of normalcy. Ajayi's home, which he shared with several housemates, didn't raise any immediate alarms. He occasionally rented out the basement through Airbnb, which, at first, appeared to account for the transient traffic at the property. He claimed this helped cover expenses while allowing him to meet new people from across the country. Yet when investigators began to dig deeper, the details of his life began to fray at the edges. At the time Mackenzie vanished, investigators had little more than fragments: text logs, location pings, and the faint trail of her last known movements. But those fragments soon formed a pattern, and that pattern began to center on one name: Ayoola Ajayi. Ajayi came to the United States on a student visa, seeking opportunity and a fresh start. He enrolled at Utah State University, though his academic record revealed a sporadic and inconsistent attendance. He eventually secured a green card, allowing him to stay in the U.S. permanently. But it was clear that AJ was someone who frequently shifted his ambitions and reinvented his narrative, depending on who was listening. While he told people he worked in tech, there were periods of unaccounted time. Online, he posted glamorous photos and even hinted at dreams of fame. Yet he was also a man of contradictions. Beneath the polished social media presence and carefully maintained persona was a darker, less coherent reality. One particularly disturbing clue came in the form of a manuscript. Investigators learned that AJ had written a novel, unpublished but available in draft form. The book followed a young man entangled in a morally ambiguous world, witnessing violence and wrestling with the choice to embrace a life of crime. While fiction by nature, the manuscript carried an unsettling tone, one that felt less like artistic exploration and more like a personal outlet. As investigators read through its pages, certain themes began to feel eerily aligned with the facts of their case. There were also personal accounts that painted a troubling picture. AJ had been divorced not long before the events in question. His ex-wife, who had since relocated to Dallas, described him to authorities as someone who instilled in her a deep and enduring sense of fear. She chose her words carefully, but firmly. She had cut ties completely, stating that she did not feel safe around him and had no intention of reestablishing any contact. Her testimony would later support the growing theory that AJ's behavior behind closed doors contrasted sharply with his public demeanor. Adding to the list of red flags, a police report from January 2019, just months before Mackenzie's disappearance, surfaced. It detailed an incident in which AJ had been investigated for a possible assault involving another woman. Though charges were never filed and the case did not proceed to court, the documentation revealed allegations of coercive and aggressive behavior. It painted a picture of someone who may have had a pattern of troubling conduct, slipping through the cracks due to a lack of formal prosecution. When detectives finally questioned AJ about Mackenzie Lick, his reaction was firm and absolute denial. He stated unequivocally that he had never met her, had never heard of her, and certainly never communicated with her. When pressed about the matching phone number found in her text logs, he offered an explanation that felt oddly rehearsed. He suggested the messages might have originated from a guest staying in his Airbnb rental, implying he had little control over who used his home phone or Wi-Fi network. The story, while technically possible, lacked credibility, and investigators knew it. Then came a revelation that significantly altered the course of the investigation. Brian Wolf, a local contractor and handyman, came forward with a highly unusual account. Months earlier, he said, AJ had hired him for what he assumed would be a standard remodeling job. But the details quickly took a strange turn. AJ asked Wolf to construct a hidden room within his house. Not just any hidden room, but one designed with very specific and very unsettling features. The request included soundproof walls, reinforced with insulation and padding. The door was to be concealed and accessible only via a biometric thumbprint scanner. Everything about the project screamed secrecy and control. AJ had emphasized that the room needed to be completed quickly. When Brian asked why the project required such secrecy and urgency, AJ gave him an answer that immediately raised suspicion. He said it was to store alcohol away from his girlfriend, who was religious and didn't approve of drinking. While Mackenzie had been raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, she was not a practicing member as an adult. Whether she was the woman AJ was referring to remained unclear. Brian felt something was wrong. The reasons he gave me just didn't make any sense, he later told investigators. The whole thing felt off. I had a bad gut feeling about it. He and his nephew, who had joined him for the job estimate, both agreed. They weren't going to take the job. We got in the truck, Brian recalled, and I said, "That was weird, right?" And my nephew goes, "Yeah, that was hella weird. We knew right then, we're not doing this." Though the project never moved forward, AJ continued messaging Brian, pressing him to reconsider. The insistence added to the growing unease around AJ's intentions. Then came the first major shift in AJ's account. Without prompting, AJ voluntarily walked into the police station. This time, his story changed. He admitted that he had, in fact, communicated with Mackenzie, contradicting his earlier statement. He claimed that they had messaged briefly after connecting through an online platform. According to AJ, she stopped responding to him after he sent her some photos of himself. "I figured maybe she wasn't interested in my type," he said. "So, I left it alone." This admission was enough. Detectives had what they needed to request a search warrant for AJ's home. When police arrived to execute the search, what they found was alarming. AJ's mattress was missing from the house. The smell of strong cleaning agents, most notably bleach, filled the air. Surveillance cameras were installed in nearly every room. The setup was not standard security. It felt excessive, almost obsessive. His basement tenants were temporarily removed from the property while the search was conducted. AJ stood nearby on the sidewalk, watching quietly as officers moved through his home, noting details, collecting evidence, and photographing the layout. As police expanded their search, one of AJ's neighbors approached them. The neighbor recalled that around the time Mackenzie went missing, they had smelled something strange in the air, something unpleasant and out of place. When they looked outside, they saw AJ pouring gasoline around a specific area of his backyard. The neighbor led police to the spot. There, behind AJ's property line, they found what was left of a fire pit, and more. Burnt clothing and a charred cell phone lay partially buried in the ashes. A large hole had also been dug nearby, recently filled in. When a specially trained K9 was brought in to assist, the dog immediately alerted to the area. It laid down at the site, a signal used to indicate the possible presence of human scent. Not long after, AJ was found sitting on a bench at a nearby park. He was brought in for a second, more focused interview. This time, police had more than theories. They had a growing mountain of circumstantial evidence. In the following days, digital forensics tied even more threads together. Mackenzie's and AJ's cell phones both pinged the same tower near Hatch Park, at the exact same time. They had arrived within a minute of one another. Security footage later confirmed that AJ's car entered the park at precisely 2:48 a.m. At 2:59 a.m., Mackenzie's final text message was sent. And then, silence. Her phone powered down at that very minute and was never turned on again. AJ's own phone showed he returned home by 3 a.m. Still, AJ maintained his innocence. He told officers they were wasting their time focusing on him. He insisted they would soon realize it was a dead end. As the investigation into Mackenzie Lueck's disappearance intensified, so too did the pressure on Ayoola Ajayi, the man who had quickly become the central figure in the case. The confidence that once cloaked him, a cold, calculated calm that unsettled even the most seasoned investigators, was beginning to crack. The weight of mounting evidence, shifting witness statements, and the media's increasing scrutiny was clearly beginning to wear him down. Then AJ's phone yielded a critical clue. Just one day after Mackenzie had last been seen, just one day after she got into his vehicle in the early hours of June 17, AJ had taken a trip to Logan Canyon, a remote and rugged stretch of wilderness located nearly 85 miles north of Salt Lake City. It was a vast, heavily forested region, scenic in daylight, daunting at night, and it quickly became the next target of the investigation. Detectives understood the significance immediately. No one drives nearly 2 hours into the mountains without a reason. Despite the overwhelming scale of the terrain, their search did not drag on for long. Down by the river, tucked beneath a thick tangle of overgrowth, they found something. Items burned and left behind. Among the ashes and debris were the charred remains of Mackenzie's purse, her personal bag, her official identification cards, and fragments of clothing consistent with what she had been wearing. These items were not just clues. They were unmistakable confirmations that Mackenzie had been there. The fire had failed to erase her presence. DNA evidence, coupled with eyewitness reports and digital data, began weaving a chilling and undeniable picture. Investigators later confirmed that items found in AJ's home, clothing, burned materials, and several unidentifiable personal objects, were also tied directly to Mackenzie. The chain of evidence was growing, and it was tightening around AJ with every new discovery. In the heart of a wooded area, Mackenzie Lueck was finally found. It was the heartbreaking conclusion to a weeks-long nightmare. The girl who had inspired such fierce love, who had sparked rallies and daily searches, had been silenced. There would be no reunion, no welcome home, only grief, and the determination for justice. Police quickly moved in and arrested 31-year-old Ayoola Ajayi. He was taken into custody on suspicion of the kidnapping and murder of Mackenzie Lueck. At his initial court appearance, which lasted just 2 minutes, he did not enter a plea. But he had no need to speak. The case against him was already overwhelming. Prosecutors had accumulated a damning array of physical, digital, and testimonial evidence. AJ's former wife, who had long feared him, told prosecutors she was willing, without hesitation, to testify against him in court. Her revulsion at what he had done was unmistakable. As the possibility of the death penalty became more than just a threat, AJ changed course. He entered a guilty plea to the charge of aggravated murder, thus avoiding trial and capital sentencing. As part of the plea deal, prosecutors dropped some of the additional charges, including aggravated kidnapping and obstruction of justice. However, the plea also resolved unrelated charges from 2 other pending criminal cases, ensuring AJ would face the full weight of accountability. In total, Ajayi faced 19 felony counts, ranging from violent crimes to various digital and financial offenses. Some of these charges were tied to content found on his personal devices, evidence that painted an even darker picture of his online behavior and disturbing intentions. In court, AJ stood before Mackenzie's parents, Greg and Diana Lueck, and offered a statement. His words were simple but heavy with implication. "I'm sorry for what I did," he said. "I deserve what I'm gonna get. I know this won't bring her back." It was a final admission from a man who had, from the start, denied everything. What remained, even after all the facts had been uncovered, was one question that no one, neither prosecutors, investigators, nor psychologists, could answer. Why? According to the district attorney, most homicide cases present clear motives: financial gain, jealousy, revenge, or perceived betrayal. But this case defied those patterns. There was no history, no relationship, no emotional entanglement. Mackenzie had never met AJ in person until the day of her disappearance. And yet, AJ later admitted in court that he had planned her death before he ever picked her up that night. The details of that morning were not recounted in court. Out of respect for the family and to prevent unnecessary trauma, many specifics were left sealed in records. What was known, however, was that the moment they returned to his home, AJ executed the plan he had already formed. A plan that ended Mackenzie's life. In the end, Ayoola Ajayi was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never be free again. The sentence reflected the severity of his crimes and ensured that he would never have the opportunity to harm another person. The criminal process was over, but the wounds it left were far from healed. The Lueck family, who had once filled their days with conversations, FaceTime calls, holiday planning, and silly pet birthday parties, were left only with memories. In a moment of grace and sorrow, the judge addressed the family saying, "We are blessed and honored to have Mackenzie in our lives for the last 23 years. The pain of losing her was evident in every word spoken in court. Each of the 3 most serious criminal charges, aggravated murder and obstruction of justice, would be served consecutively.